Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another installment of the EBI seminar series on science communications. I'm joined today by Michael Ranney. Michael is a professor in the Berkeley School of Education here at UC Berkeley, though he works within multiple spheres of academia, such as psychology, journalism, and cognitive science. He tackles the problem of communicating climate change, and his current research involves experiments that test what materials persuade people the most to accept that global warming is both happening and requires action. How are you doing today, Michael?
Pretty well, thanks.
Sure thing. Okay, so we have a series of questions, and I'm going to start with the first one, which is, can you give a more detailed description of your research and its goals, including your website, howglobalwarmingworks.org?
Sure. That's a pretty broad question, so I think I'll have to break it down into some pieces. One way I can sort of contextualize it is that my research team generally has looked at three different intersecting spheres. One is sort of science education, and another one is math or numeracy, and then finally there's like societal importance. And I think right there in the center spot of that triple intersection is where I think climate change cognition is, and that's what excites me the most. And I guess I've got two main goals. Both of them quite modest. One is just to keep increasing awareness and concern about global warming so quickly and get it so high that all humans act to keep the Earth as optimal as possible. And one of the ways we do that is we try to find ways to change people's minds. So we've got about a dozen ways to change people's minds in about 5 minutes or less. And it turns out a lot of people don't know good scientific information about global warming. So we provide that. And we also run experiments to see if these things work. So these are, randomized control experiments to actually see if there's a causality between what we're doing and what changes people are experiencing in terms of their beliefs and their attitudes and understanding. So all that has sort of been like my day job as a cognitive scientist, assessing these things and so forth and writing up papers about them. And then there's my night job, which is kind of like the outreach. It's giving talks and interviews like this one, offering good climate science to the public, helping change people's minds. And part of that is our website, as you mentioned, howglobalwarmingworks.org. And our modest goal on that is to get about 7.5 billion unique visitors.
Okay, perfect. So, moving into your talks, like you mentioned, you highlight the need for empathy in these talks. Why is empathy important for promoting climate change knowledge?
Well, I think there are two different ways that empathy plays out, really. And I think they're important going either way. One is that climate researchers obviously can't understand why people deny climate change or are slow to accept it if they don't like listen closely and put themselves in other people's shoes to try to understand what their life is like, what their cognition, what their belief structures are like, and their values and so forth. And on the flip side, I think a lot of lay people don't have much of a clue about what the reward structure is in science and how scientists live their lives and what they find useful and how they get by or advance. And so one of the ways we actually change people's minds is just explaining the reward structure of science. And we use this, like, you can do this in under 250 words. You can do it very quickly, just have them read something. This sort of explains that scientists, unlike how some people purport, aren't just like going along to get along. They're not just, saying anything regardless of what they believe, just to get grants and things like that. There are lots of ways that scientists can be rewarded, and they have like high job satisfaction, low unemployment. They don't have to do climate science if they don't want. And obviously, like Albert Einstein didn't win the Nobel Prize by just writing, "I agree with Niels Bohr." You really get fame in science by, sort of overturning the common beliefs of other scientists, the general paradigm. And indeed, most scientists really wish global warming weren't true. And so I highlight this in my talks. So I always give this pledge. I'll say, like, I, like just about any other scientist or almost any other human, would be so happy that global warming were not true. If someone could please debunk me of this and disabuse me of this notion, no matter where they're from, I will rent the largest SUV I can find, drive to wherever that person is, thank them profusely, stop doing work in this entirely, give back any dollar I ever got on climate change, education, cognition, etc. And then I would split the Nobel Prize with them, because if you could actually show that global warming weren't happening or some sort of hoax or something like that, you definitely would win the Nobel Prize. You'd be the most famous scientist ever. And so we just bundle that into like 250 words, and that helps people empathize with what the life of a scientist is like and what really motivates them. And on the flip side, again, listening to other people is really crucial. Like some of my biggest insights about climate change cognition have come from listening to people sitting next to me on airplanes as they're watching me work on talks or things like that, or interviewing people in a bowling alley in Denver, or writing with people on ATVs in Kansas, or I once gave a talk in a bar in Lubbock, Texas, which was a big eye opener. So again, empathy really is important both ways.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like what you're highlighting is that climate change conversations can come in all different kinds of forms.
For sure.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next question, which is attention span is something that people can't seem to get enough of these days, talking about it in social media, TikTok, et cetera, et cetera. So, how does attention span play into your research goals and findings?
Oh yeah, that's a really an obvious finding. There are lots of different research studies that have shown a drop in attention span. And so that's one of the reasons why we keep our interventions whenever we can to under 5 minutes. So like our website, How Global Warming Works, we actually have 5 videos on them, that go from like less than 1 minute over to less than 5 minutes. And I really wouldn't recommend this one because it's so short. There's really just like 35 words of real science information in it. But if you have like a crazy uncle that only has enough attention span for like a cat video, then definitely that's one you would send them to. But like the 5 minute one is much better. It even explains what makes something a greenhouse gas. And our experiments actually show that the longer you watch our videos, the more you understand about climate change and the more it changes your mind about it in terms of acceptance of global warming and concern about it. So the 5 minute one is the best if one can do it. And I should point out that these are narrated by a star of stage and screen, Daveed Diggs, who won a Tony for Hamilton and has starred in various movies and TV series and so forth. So we're pretty happy about his mellifluous voice being our narrator.
That's really impressive having him as, a speaker.
Yeah, we're lucky.
Okay, so sticking with the conversation of, statistics and what your research has found, your research demonstrates 12 ways to change people's minds about global warming. Can you give us your favorite or maybe what you find to be most effective top four from that list?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, we've got about a dozen ways we've shown that increase people's acceptance of global warming. And one thing I should say about these is it increases acceptance both in liberals and conservatives. So there's no polarization or anything. Our interventions sort of raise all the boats, because sometimes there's a concern that you might get like a backfire effect if especially conservatives think that you're trying to propagandize them, or even worse, that they polarize and say, I believe even less in global warming. And none of that happens. They're pretty successful in raising all boats, as I said. And so one of the ways that we started with actually was just explaining the mechanism of global warming, like why Earth is getting hotter. And you'd think that this is pretty common knowledge, but in fact, if you actually ask people, only about 1 in 300 people can really answer this at like better than like a B plus level or something like that. And I didn't know it when I started this line of research. So, a lot of this research is actually based upon my initial ignorance. And it's not just me. I took a walk the other day with a friend of mine who's got a doctorate, and he thought he knew what it was. And when it came down to it, he really didn't, and he wasn't even close. So it's kind of secret knowledge that most people don't know. And it's in our videos, and I even have it down to a haiku, actually. But just learning this mechanism, either through the videos or reading a text about it, increases people's acceptance of global warming. So that's kind of one way, just explaining in physical, chemical terms why we're actually getting hotter. And in fact, I pass out these cards when I give in-person talks, and we have like a 35 words here that sort of explains the mechanism. And on the other side is a different way we increase people's acceptance of global warming is with statistics. So we ask people to fill in the blanks here with estimates of particular quantities, give us numbers. And it turns out that they realize that they don't know these numbers are often shockingly scary in terms of climate change. And that's really important for all of our research. We find it's important for people to like put their cards on the table and make a guess, whether they're guessing about the mechanism or guessing these statistics. And these statistics change people's minds as well. It increases their understanding and their concern and their acceptance that global warming is going on. And then we have another way that we use temperature graphs, and we actually contrast these with the stock market. So it turns out if you look through various publications, even fancy ones like the New York Times or something like that, you rarely actually see, the increases in acceptance, increases in temperature over time that's being caused by global warming. It's just a pure plot of temperature over time. And so we actually have an intervention where we contrast that with the stock market going up. And so they look a little bit like this. And you can kind of get a sense that both of those are obviously going up. People usually can't even tell the difference between which one is the stock market, which one is the temperature over time. But it's very compelling in our little 5-minute intervention that, yeah, it looks like we're getting hotter. And then the fourth way that I sort of alluded to already and described to some degree was why you should trust climate scientists. So those four are roughly the ones I would pull out, 4+1 if you count both videos and the text regarding the mechanism.
Awesome. Those all seem like super compelling ways. So, sticking again with this kind of like empirical mode of testing things, you're a little bit different from the rest of our speakers in that your sentiments are largely based on, experimental data. So, what do you find is useful about communicative studies that do have the stats or the data to back them up?
Yeah, well, I think that just like in the physical or biological sciences, the cognitive sciences are best when they involve experiments as well. Best in terms of finding causality. There are lots of other studies one can do if you don't have hypotheses yet and so forth. But once you have hypotheses, you really should be generating experiments to see what's going on causally. So, for instance, in our studies, we usually have a kind of sandwich model of the study where we have some sort of intervention, whether it's like the trust in scientists or the mechanism. And then before we give that to participants, we give them a pre-test and then we give them a post-test later. So it's sort of like a sandwich. And so you can see if they're higher on the pre-test than they were on the post-test, then you've increased people's acceptance or understanding or concern about global warming. And so you can tell you've tweaked one thing and something else happens. And so there's a causal connection. In fact, sometimes we find that it's bicausal where you can change things the other way, and that works just fine as well. And again, this is important because, like, well, what if it's only worked for conservatives or not for liberals or vice versa? But this is how we know that it works for both groups. And there are some scientists that mostly just rely on correlations, and they think, well, since these things are correlated, I'm just going to throw this at them, and hopefully it'll increase this, but I won't really be assessing that. And then there are some people that just generate curricular material or interventions about climate change that aren't even assessed at all, don't even have correlations. They just think, oh, as a climate scientist, I know what climate science is. I'm going to use my really darn smart brain to put it out there, and I'm sure it'll be fine. But they never know because they don't test it. And sometimes these materials aren't great. Sometimes they're useless. And sometimes, in the rare case, they're actually counterproductive, where you can actually inhibit people's acceptance of global warming just because you don't have an understanding of the entire panoply of participants who are out there, because people are all very different. And something that might work for one person might really not work for another person.
So you're getting a lot at this idea of and the role of audiences, which obviously has a huge part in, communicating to those audiences. So what do you think is the most interesting thing you found that you have to be cognizant of as you're communicating to various audiences?
Well, I guess when I went into this, I thought that it would be a relatively simple space. There'd be a few misconceptions that people would have about climate change or global warming, and we just had to give them that little bit of information that would change their mind. But now that I've been in this game for a little while, I realize that there are probably 15 or more central reasons that a particular individual might deny that global warming is happening or have serious doubts about it or something like that. And it's sort of a little bit like the kind of Russian literature quote, that happy families are all alike, but unhappy families are different in their own unique way. Well, I wouldn't use that exactly. It's not that everyone who understands climate change or accepts it do so in the exact same way. But it is the case that people have very different panoplies of information when they deny climate change. So of these 15, you might have someone who has like a table of denial that has like 3 legs, and then someone else who has like a table of denial that has 4 legs, and they might not even overlap. They might be completely different subsets. But I see my job as a climate educator is just to knock out these misconceptions or alternative misconceptions about global warming so that their table of denial falls to the ground and they come to realize what's really going on. But then beyond this whole realm of science, there are other things, obviously, like political elements going on. There are a lot of emotions like fear and greed and learned helplessness. People might think, well, what am I going to eat when I get old? Or what's going to happen if I have grandkids or something like that. And so that can make you want to put your head in the sand and sort of connected with the notion of learned helplessness in some ways as well. So there's a lot going on. And I think what I found most interesting is just how large this set is. It's certainly not infinite, and I think we're getting a good handle on it. But no two people are alike, obviously, and no two people who are reticent to accept global warming are alike either.
Yeah, that's hard to address. It's difficult to get everyone's priorities and conceptions under, one general umbrella. Okay, so to wrap our conversation up, we just have one last question, which is just getting at, the stakes of this matter. Why is climate change education important given other educational priorities?
Oh, good question. Yeah, I'd say that you know lots of education is really good and really important. And historically, people have sometimes caricatured education as the 3 R's. Reading, writing, and arithmetic. And if they're kind, they'll throw in a fourth R about reasoning. And reasoning is really where I live as a scientist, as a cognitive scientist. It's my gig. I study problem solving. Thinking, reasoning, those sorts of things. And it's a pretty important domain to me. And in fact, I have some empirical data about this because for decades I've occasionally asked undergraduates what they think the world's biggest problem is, what the planet's biggest problem is. And mostly these fall into two different kinds of groups. Like on the one hand, there's sort of this kindness element where people say, really, everything would be fine if people were kinder to each other. It's sort of humans, inhumanity to humans, that's really the problem. But then there's this other group that's sort of resource oriented that thinks like, well, there's overpopulation and we may not have enough food and we're using up our planet's resources and will we run out of petroleum and things like that. And certainly climate change is in that realm. And over the years, I've seen climate change just zoom in terms of the importance that these people ascribe to it. And indeed, I wasn't that particularly interested in climate change until I realized how important it was as well. I used to look at evolution and why people were reticent to accept evolution. But it just occurred to me that it really didn't matter so much. Like if you're a farmer in Iowa, you could deny evolution. You could raise your crops and your livestock, and you could even be using seed corn that has been modified based on evolutionary principles, and you never know about it. And life would go on. You just have this sort of glitch in your understanding of what's really going on with the world and biology. But climate change is really something dangerous, even if you're an Iowa farmer. Like if the winters aren't cold enough to kill off the insects and so forth. If it's too warm in the summer, then you don't have enough water to irrigate. You have to use more pesticides because the insects were gone. You might have an early frost because there's a false spring because we're getting warmer. So there are a lot of reasons why you'd want to be worried about climate change if you aren't. And so I think this fourth R is really important because, if reasoning is really not going well, and that means that your future isn't as good as it could be, then that's a problem for you. And so when I thought about this and I was thinking of switching, I thought, well, gee, would 95-year-old Michael be happy if he, woke up one day in a nursing home and said, I think I could have done something about that, but boy, Netflix was so good. And so I want to inspire people who are listening to this to also, take the reins of this issue and try to help as well. Like you can vote for people who will inhibit global warming the fastest and the soonest, and to the greatest degree. And we also hope that you'll be looking at our website, howglobalwarmingworks.org, and pass that along to other people because we think the information is obviously useful, given that it's based on our experiments. And we think it'll be helpful and maybe speeding a better future.
Absolutely. So, yeah, you outline the stakes of the matter. You mention how important it is, and it's good that people are looking forward and, being cognizant of this, but it's what you're doing is great and you provide a lot of valuable resources. And yes, I think that your speak is really inspiring. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, Logan. It's really been a pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you. So that just about does it for all of our questions. The EBI and myself wish you the best of luck on all your future endeavors, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for checking out the EBI seminar series on science communication. If you've enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe to our channel for more content on how science is communicated. Be sure to follow along for future installments or check out our previous series and explore social media, which are all linked in the description below. Thanks for watching and see you next time.